The morning Preston Halcourt announced that Meridian Grid Corp would no longer be requiring Vivienne Asare's technical guidance. He chose to do it in the main boardroom on the 32nd floor of the Meridian Tower on Bay Street, with the gray October sky pressing flat against the floor-to-ceiling windows, and 11 people seated around a polished table who had, at various points in their career, relied entirely on the system she had built to keep their lights on. He did not lower his voice. He did not pull her aside first. He stood at the head of the table in a dark navy suit that probably cost more than 3 months of most people's salaries, and he told the room, told it, not her, that Meridian was moving into what he called its modernization phase, and that phase would require an entirely new technical advisory structure, built on what he described as proper engineering, credentials, and institutional experience. He said it the way people say things when they have practiced the words and still cannot make them sound reasonable. Vivienne Asare sat 3 chairs to his left. She was 44 years old, wore a charcoal blazer over a plain white shirt, and had been awake since 4:30 that morning, reviewing integration protocols on her laptop before anyone else on Bay Street had thought to set their alarms. She had built Meridian's smart grid control system from a concept sketch on a torn envelope in the back booth of a Tim Hortons in Scarborough 11 years ago. The system now managed power distribution for roughly 2 million homes across the province. She did not interrupt him. She did not look away. Preston read off the 12 incoming consultants like a liturgy. MIT's and Stanford's and LSE's, patents and publications and keynote addresses at conferences that cost more to attend than Vivienne's first car had cost to buy. The consultants would be taking over all technical oversight of the control system, effective immediately. When he finished, the room stayed quiet. A few people looked at Vivienne with the careful blankness of those who wanted to appear neutral but were actually just afraid to be seen on the wrong side of a decision that had already been made. Vivienne picked up her notebook, the same battered, black-covered thing she had carried for 20 years, and capped her pen and slid her chair back from the table with a sound that seemed louder than it should have been in all that quiet. She thanked Preston by name, without irony and without warmth. She nodded to the 2 people at the table she actually respected. Then she walked out of the boardroom and pressed the elevator button and rode down 32 floors without saying another word, watching the numbers descend. Somewhere below the steadiness in her face, there was something that would take a few days to name. What Preston Halcourt knew about Vivienne Asare could be printed on half a page. What he had chosen to know was even less. He had found the gap in her resume during his first week as CEO. 1 year of computer science at Ryerson, now Toronto Metropolitan University, before the trail went cold. No degree, no professional engineering certification, no publications. Just a company she had started at 26 in the back bedroom of a row house in Scarborough with $3,000 saved from working 2 jobs simultaneously, and a system that had, over the following decade and a half, become quietly essential to infrastructure across the country. Her company, Asare, was now valued at just over $1 billion. Preston drew his conclusion in under a minute and closed the file. What he did not know, had not thought to learn, was where that system had actually come from. Vivienne had grown up the second daughter of a woman who cleaned offices on the midnight shift, and a father who repaired televisions and radios and anything else people brought to his shop on Lawrence Avenue East. From the time she was 9 years old, she had sat on a stool behind the counter of that shop after school and watched him work, learning to listen to the particular sounds a failing circuit made before it failed completely, learning to read the specific way heat moved through a component about to give out. By the time she was 12, she could diagnose a fault in the time what the television was doing wrong. Explaining, her father called it an ear for machines, and he said it like it was something worth more than any certificate on any wall. When the 12 consultants arrived at Meridian's operations center 2 weeks after Vivienne's departure, they came with the easy confidence of people accustomed to being hired to solve problems that had defeated everyone else. They were given access to every document, every schematic, every log file associated with the control system, and they were told that the system needed to reach full operational state before a critical federal demonstration the following month. 1. That would determine whether Meridian received a $4 billion infrastructure contract from the Government of Canada. They began exactly as formally trained engineers begin. Systematically, they mapped every input parameter, ran every diagnostic sequence in the documentation, cross-referenced initialization protocols with industry standards, and fed raw data into 3 separate analysis platforms running simultaneously. Every output told them the same thing. The system was in perfect condition. No fault in any component, no irregularity in any connection. And yet, each time they ran the full initialization sequence, the system stalled at a specific stage and failed silently, returning to standby without explanation. They spent 3 days eliminating hardware causes. They replaced 2 interface modules. They brought in additional equipment to measure thermal variance, at a resolution the original installation had never required. Everything came back within tolerance. The system sat exactly where it had been when they arrived, operational in theory, non-functional in practice, indifferent to every tool money could supply. Tension inside the operations center climbed in the quiet way professional environments accumulate pressure, not in arguments or raised voices, but in shortened sentences and coffee cups left untouched on counters, and the particular look people get when they understand that the problem they were hired to solve is not the problem they actually understand. Preston sent messages through his assistant, demanding updates every few hours. The replies said that work was continuing and progress was being made, which was a polite way of saying that nothing had changed. On the 4th evening, long after the consultants had gone for the night, a systems engineer named Bernard Kowalski sat alone in the control room, with a stack of printed logs and a lukewarm coffee from the machine down the hall. Bernard was 62 years old, had been with Meridian for 19 years, and had spent the last 2 weeks watching men younger and far more credentialed than himself do everything correctly and get absolutely nowhere. He was not looking for anything specific when he opened the archived project files. He was looking for something to rule out, because ruling things out was the only forward motion available to him. What he found instead was a folder of handwritten notes, scanned and uploaded during the original system installation, in a script he recognized immediately because he had seen it on sign-off sheets and margin annotations for 11 years. Vivienne Asare's notes covered what the formal documentation did not. Not because she had forgotten to include things, but because they described a logic that she had considered self-evident. The kind of understanding that lives in a person's hands before it lives in any words. The initialization sequence she had designed did not follow the industry standard order of operations. It followed the order the system itself needed, which was different, and which she had worked out through years of watching similar systems fail at specific moments and understanding why. Her sequence accounted for a warm-up dynamic that no static diagnostic could detect, because it was not a malfunction. It was a living quality of the system, and it required patience rather than override. Bernard read the notes twice. He sat very still for a long time afterward. When he brought them to Preston the next morning, Preston stared at the documents for a long moment without speaking. Then he asked where Vivienne Asare was now. Nobody in the building had maintained contact with her since she walked out. Asartech was easy enough to locate. It was headquartered in a building she owned in Scarborough, 3 blocks from the street where she had grown up. Calls to her office went through the receptionist and stopped there. It was Bernard who eventually reached her, because Bernard had her personal number, and was the only person in the building who had thought to maintain that relationship after her departure. She was not hiding, she was working. When Preston arrived at the Asare Tech building on a gray Tuesday morning, wearing the same kind of expensive coat that looked precisely wrong on a street like that one, He found her in a meeting with her own engineers reviewing specifications for a new municipal system in Halifax. Her assistant asked him to wait. He waited for 14 minutes. She came out to the reception area herself, in a dark pullover and jeans, a tablet under her arm. She did not look surprised to see him. She looked like a person who had already done the math on why he was there and had already made her decision. He told her Meridian needed her back. He told her the system would not initialize. He told her about the $4 billion contract and the demonstration in less than 3 weeks and the consequences if the system did not run. She listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she said no. He had not expected that. He had expected negotiation, or conditions, or at minimum a pause suggesting consideration. She simply said no and waited for him to say something else. He asked her why. He said it more gently than he had said most things to most people in his life, and she seemed to notice that. She sat down in one of the reception chairs and told him something that did not appear anywhere in any document associated with her company or her system. When she was 22 years old, working as a contract technician for a power distribution firm in Mississauga, she had identified a flaw in a grid initialization process that had been causing intermittent failures for over a year. The official engineering team had classified it as a hardware issue and spent 9 months replacing components without fixing it. She spent 3 weeks on her own time, after her contract hours ended, working through every variable she could access, until she isolated the actual cause. A sequencing gap that existed not in any single component, but in the interaction between them during startup. It could not be measured in isolation. It could only be felt in the whole system running in real conditions. She had submitted her findings to the lead engineer on the project. He had thanked her by email. 2 weeks later, he had presented the solution to the company's executive team as his own breakthrough. He received a significant bonus and a promotion to technical director. She received a 2-sentence note saying her contract would not be renewed. She never reported it. She never filed a formal complaint. She went home to Scarborough and called her father to tell him what had happened and spent the next 4 months of nights and weekends writing the framework that would eventually become Asare Tech's first product. She took what should have made her bitter and turned it into something she owned completely and that no one could take from her. Preston was quiet for a moment. The reception area smelled faintly of coffee and dry erase markers and bore absolutely no resemblance to the boardroom on the 32nd floor where he had dismissed her without a second thought. He asked whether she had ever regretted not fighting back. She told him she had learned a long time ago that the most useful thing she could do with an injustice was decide what to build from it. He returned the next day, and the day after that, bringing nothing with him except the willingness to sit and listen. He offered a senior advisory contract worth more than she needed. She turned it down without discussion. He offered a formal written apology. She accepted that one. On the 4th visit, she agreed to come in, not because of anything he had offered, but because Bernard had sent her a message the previous evening. A short one, telling her that the system was running below what it was designed for, and that it had always done better when someone who understood it was nearby. She had laughed at that, alone in her kitchen in Scarborough at 10:30, in a way that surprised her. The laughter settled something she had not realized was still unsettled. She walked into Meridian's operations center on a Thursday morning, and the room did what rooms do when someone arrives who was not expected to return. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. A few of the consultants, who had never actually met her, did not understand what they were watching, but they understood that something had shifted before they could name what it was. She did not make a speech. She walked to the main console, stood still for a moment, with her eyes moving across the display panels, the way her father's eyes had moved across a dismantled radio before he touched anything. She asked the technician to open the initialization log from the most recent failed attempt. She read it for approximately 90 seconds. Then she typed a sequence into the parameter interface that none of the 12 consultants had found in any documentation, because it was not in any documentation. It existed in her, the way things exist in people who have paid enough attention to something long enough that understanding no longer requires words. She looked at the technician and told him to run it now. The system came online in 47 seconds, clean, smooth, producing the particular low hum of 2 million households held in careful balance. A sound that Vivienne Asare had first heard in her own design 11 years ago and had carried with her since. A sound she had never quite been able to describe to anyone who had not already heard it themselves. No one in the room said anything for a moment. Several consultants stood looking at the live display with the expression of people revising their understanding of something they had thought they already understood. Preston stood at the back of the room with his eyes on the display, and something behind them that looked, for the first time since Vivienne had known him, genuinely open. He called a company-wide meeting 2 days later. He stood in front of all of Meridian's staff and told them, in a voice stripped of the rehearsed confidence it usually carried, that he had made a decision based on paper and had been wrong in a way that nearly cost the company everything. He said that the most valuable expertise in the building had never come from the right letterhead, and that he intended to build something different going forward, and that he understood saying it was considerably easier than doing it. Several longtime employees exchanged looks that contained entire histories. Vivienne was not in the room for that speech. She was in the operations center with 3 of the consultants, who had, over the preceding 2 days, approached her one by one to ask if she would be willing to explain the system to them. Not the documentation, but the thinking behind it. She said yes to all 3, because she had never in her life turned down someone who was genuinely willing to learn. Over the following weeks, the operations center became something it had not been before. The consultants stopped arguing with what the system was doing and started listening to it. Vivienne's original notes were printed and mounted at the entrance to the control room at Bernard's suggestion, not as decoration, but as a reminder that the things not written in any manual were often the most important things of all. Preston formalized a new internal policy. Any solution proposed for Meridian's technical infrastructure, regardless of the title or background of the person proposing it, would be evaluated on what it actually did. The policy was called, informally, the Listen First rule, and it began every session with 30 seconds of silence before anyone opened a laptop. On the day of the federal demonstration, the system initialized in under a minute in front of government officials and infrastructure executives who had no idea how close the entire program had come to collapse. The demonstration was flawless. The contract was awarded. Vivienne watched it from the back of the room, beside Bernard, who said nothing because nothing needed to be said. She had not come back to prove a point. She had come back because the system was running below its potential, and she could not easily tolerate that. Her father had told her once, in the back of a repair shop on Lawrence Avenue, that a machine not running right was a machine with something left to say, and that the only respectful thing a person could do was stop and listen. She had never stopped listening. Not to the machines, and not to the people who built things with their hands rather than their titles. Preston Halcourt learned the hardest way a person can learn something. By being wrong in a way the world could see, and having to stay in the room afterward and rebuild from what was left. He learned it completely. That, at least, Vivienne gave him credit for.